So let's start with the session itself. Thank you everyone for joining this. I'm Agnes, and I'm here to talk about how to properly handle errors and exceptions in Power Automate Cloud Flows. Just a sec. Before I start on the actual topic, a quick intro to me. So as Mohammed actually mentioned, since recently I'm a Microsoft MVP, specifically in the Power Automate area. And I run an agency that specializes in process improvement and automation. So, Power Automate and RPA in general is something that I'm rather knowledgeable about. So I do actually talk on these sorts of kind of advanced topics when it comes to automation. Right. And the topic, as I mentioned, is error handling in Power Automate, and the agenda is pretty straightforward. I'll share a few slides where I'll take you through the basics of the topic. I'll explain the concepts, and then I'll switch to a demo where I'll actually show you what that looks like in practice and how to actually do it. And then at the end, if we have any questions, we can have a Q&A session. You're welcome to post any questions during the session, but I will not actually be monitoring the chat, so I'll answer them at the end. Right, so the reason why I talk about error handling in the first place is, well, because it's important. Regardless of how much effort and time you actually put into building your flows, unexpected things can and will eventually happen. What we don't want, obviously, is those unexpected things breaking our enterprise environments, obviously. So we need some sort of, handling for those errors so that they don't actually make all hell break loose in there. However, since Power Automate is, essentially a low-code, no-code tool, and is marketed heavily towards citizen developers who have no prior experience or background in IT, there's lots of users out there that simply do not know how to do error handling, or that they need to do it in the first place. And unfortunately, Power Automate does not actually come with any sort of a framework for handling errors or logging out of the box. And this applies both to cloud flows and desktop flows. Actually, there are no templates available or anything. There is just some best practices out there that are generally just shared by experts and people like myself online, and not really by Microsoft officially. And as such, not all of those recommended practices are actually equally good. So I'm here to actually tell you what I think are the best ways to do it. Now, the not very convenient or obvious thing about handling errors in Power Automate Cloud Flows is the fact that it's essentially done via the so-called run after settings on the following action, and not the action that we're actually handling. So we need to set up these sorts of rules, these sorts of, at least that's what it looks like in the old designer. We need to set this up after the action that we're trying to handle, which means that we need to add extra steps for each thing that we want to handle, extra steps that do the actual handling, which is something I find, rather inconvenient, to be honest, and not very obvious to figure out when we're starting up. Now, when we do actually start handling those errors, there are three ways in which we could do it. The first one is, no error handling, essentially what we do when we're beginning our journey in Power Automate. We don't implement any exception handling. What this means essentially is that our flows will stop on the first error, and that's not recommended for obvious reasons. Don't do that. A slightly better approach is using the so-called action level error handling, where we apply specific rules on every single action that could potentially fail. So we add some rules and some steps on every action in our flow. But as mentioned, because we need to use the run after settings and add extra steps for everything we want to handle, this would essentially mean we need to add extra actions for every single action in our flow if we want to handle any errors in it. And as such, it can easily make even the simplest flows, into large and complex and hard to understand constructs, just overly complex where it's not really necessary. So it's, again, not really recommended. And the actually recommended approach and way in handling errors is using scopes, which is a container that is used to actually group several actions into a single blob that we can then handle at once. So we can actually implement error handling on the entire scope. In this way, making our flows much easier. And it's also much easier to implement as well, because we need to add less of those error handling settings and steps on our flows. Now, when we do handle the error, we usually want to not just handle it and continue our flow, but also get the details of the error in some form or way, so that we can then log it, or maybe build some branching in our flow depending on the type of error or whatever. But usually, at the very least, for logging and reporting, so that we know what happened and can potentially fix our flow if it actually needs fixing. And there are a couple of expressions that we can use to get this, depending on the approach we take. So if, for whatever reason, we went with the not really recommended approach of handling actions instead of scopes, we could use the actions expression, which would return the outputs of the action. Or if we go with the scopes approach, with the recommended one, we can use the result expression, which would return the outputs of the entire scope. Both of these will actually return a JSON object similar to this one. This is for a single action, actually, but if we handle a scope, this would just be in an array for all of the actions within the scope. Also, an important thing to note over here is the fact that result actually works for all containers, and scopes is not the only the container available in Power Automate. There are also conditions and loops. These are also considered to be containers, as they are actions that can contain other actions inside of them. So if we wanted to handle them, we could also use result to handle a condition or a loop as well. However, there's a few tricky things about this, and there's one problem, or the major one, I would say, is the fact that there are at least 4 different output schemas for the actual errors that we could get using either of the expressions. As mentioned, they would both essentially return the same thing, except the result expression returns an array of objects, whereas actions returns a single object. But essentially, the actual contents of the object will still be the same, and the schemas of the error message will actually depend on the action that has failed. And there are at least 4 of them. A shout out goes to David Wyatt, actually, for finding the first 3. He blogs on his blog about it, but I've actually found that this can actually change, because I couldn't reproduce type 3 myself when I made a create item action on the SharePoint connector failed. I got a different error, and that's the one I listed as type 4. Apparently, this one David didn't find on his tests. So that's a 4th type as well. So it might have just changed since he did it, or it might be that there are even more of these that we didn't found yet. In addition to that, even though obviously scopes is the recommended approach, and it should be obvious by now, there are a couple of issues with using it as well. First of all, it only works properly when there is no nesting of containers in your scopes. So what this means is that if you have a condition within your scope, which is also a container, you will actually need a different schema. That is because whatever actions you have inside the condition will actually be within, two levels of the containers. There is a scope, that's the first level, and then there's the condition inside the scope, that's the second level. And if you have any actions outside of the condition, but within the same scope, they won't work with the same schema that you use for the condition because they're at the different levels of container nesting. And that's an issue, obviously. In addition to that, as if that wasn't fun enough, loops that are also containers have a completely different schema for the outputs from conditions and scopes. So the recommendation here is obviously to try to use as few containers and as little nesting of containers if possible if you're actually using scopes for handling errors. Right, so previously, when I wasn't aware of the different schemas, I used to use the create HTML table action and convert the outputs of the result expression into a pretty table that I could then send to myself via email or push to a Teams message or whatever. But this apparently never worked with nested containers, obviously, such as loops and conditions inside my scopes. And it also didn't really work that well with actions that actually have different schemas. But then I realized that, I don't really need a table as outputs for my error because there's always just a single error, in all of the cases, or at least in the vast majority of cases when I build my flows, it can only have a single error. Because as soon as there is an error, my exception handling will kick in and further actions will usually be skipped. So I don't really need a table to return a single error. I'm fine with a single string. And the string is actually more versatile because I can use it for logging. I can push it to a database or do whatever I want with it. And then I found that it's actually even easier to get a single string than it is to get a proper table. And it can be done relatively easily using the coalesce expression in combination with all of the different schemas. The coalesce expression, is built specifically to return the first non-null value of all of the inputs that you provide into it, meaning that if I push all of the different schemas into it, most of them will return null, when they don't apply. But the one that does apply to the action that failed will actually return a value, and coalesce will pick that one out. So essentially, we need to build a result expression for each schema. Then we need to apply some sorting, and then we use coalesce to get it. Now, the sorting part is also something that I need to explain, and yeah, I will actually share the full expression later on in the slides afterwards. This is just as much as I could fit into a note on an action in Power Automate. So the result expression with the schema is here that would actually return a single item. Now we need to use some sorting because result actually returns the outputs of all actions within the container, meaning including also the succeeded actions if there were any before the error occurred. So if you've got 6 actions or 7 actions or whatever in your scope, and the first 3 run successfully and there's the 4th one fails, the exception handling will kick in, and then the result expression will actually return the outputs of all of the actions that ran, including those that succeeded. But we don't care about those, and we don't really need their values. So we sort the result first by status, so that the failed item is the first one after we sort it. Then we pick up the first item using the index, and then we try to parse it with the particular schema. And we apply the same thing to all of the schemas. And so in most cases, when for succeeded actions where this doesn't apply, or for failed actions where this schema doesn't apply, this will actually return null, and coalesce will pick up the one that actually has an error message. Right. So I think I'm stepping into relatively deep waters by now, and it's time for me to actually skip to a demo, switch to a demo, and show you what it actually looks like in real life. It's really much simpler to actually see it in a Power Automate Cloud Flow than understand it from a PowerPoint slideshow. Right. So first of all, a bit of context to my flows. Now, I hope you'll forgive my ignorance over here. I just kind of realized that I'm speaking to the audience that probably doesn't consume alcohol like yesterday with too little time to change my demos. But I generally don't like building flows that do nothing. So I usually like to add a bit of a personal touch to it, regardless of the topic, even if it's a general kind of dry topic like error handling. I would still like to build something useful for it. And I actually used it for a recent passion of mine, which is making cocktail. And some of these are actually alcohol-free, but yeah, sorry about actually not realizing that this doesn't probably apply to the audience of today. But anyway, what I did was I created a list of recipes and I pushed it to SharePoint. And I've got this list over here of all of the recipes that I've tried, or some that I haven't tried yet, but I would like to. And I added, the actual preparation instructions, the ingredients, and some tags for filtering and whether or not I have actually tried it so far. I created a separate list for ingredients and, where I can actually check whether or not I actually have it available at home at the moment. So, whether or not I can actually use it. And then I've made it as simple and straightforward as possible for the purpose of the demo, but the ingredients field in the recipe list is actually a lookup field, so I can actually trace the ingredients with the recipe. Right, so this is what it is. And then I've got a few flows within a solution where I've just, I've pretty much just implemented more or less, similar logic in all of them. They all come back with recommendations for me on what I could make, based on some different filters. Some of them recommend some of my favorite recipes, and some recommend something that I haven't tried but should, and so on. But I built them in 4 different ways where I demonstrate 4 different approaches to actually how to handle errors in Power Automate Cloud Flows. Now, the most popular and frequent approach that you may have heard of is the so-called try, catch, and finally, or try, catch, and continue, or whatever. And it comes from software programming, where it actually is applied and is called like that in some languages. Now, the idea behind this approach is that we have a container that is called try, where we put in most of our actual flow, in this case, just a couple of actions. Then we have another container that's called catch that kicks in if there is an error in try and does all of the error handling that we want. And then we have a finally or continue or whatever that then runs regardless of whether there was an error in try or not. What this essentially means is that, in some cases that might make sense, but this needs to be built in a way where it runs and doesn't really depend on the outputs of try. Now, the correct way to set this up is to, again, work with the run after settings. So we need to set up catch to only run when try has failed or timed out. And we want finally to run when catch is either successful or skipped. That's because if try actually fails, if there's an exception there, catch will kick in, hopefully succeed, and then we want finally to run. But if there is no exception in try, then catch will not run, so it will be skipped, and we still want finally to run. So that's why we need this checkbox as well. Now, I hope you forgive me for using the old designer here. Apparently, Power Automate, for some reason, discriminated me a bit depending on my location. When I'm in Lithuania on a Lithuanian IP address, I can't even enable the new designer. But when I was in Hamburg delivering this session a couple of weeks ago, actually, it was turned on by default when I was on German IP address. So apparently Lithuanians cannot use the new designer yet for whatever reason. Anyway, I personally don't really like this approach, but I can demonstrate what the way it works. First of all, maybe just a quick thing. This will just give me a recommendation of my favorite cocktail. So if I run this like that, what it will do is it will get the items. It will just do a select on the names, and then it actually will send me an email, which looks somewhat like this. So I've got some favorites in there. And then if I make it fail, for instance, by pushing a filter on a column that doesn't exist, because the available column is a part of the ingredients list and not the recipe list, what I'll get is a couple of emails, actually, because my catch also sends me an email. So what this will look like, I get a recommendation that says it couldn't get the recommendations, and then an error message as well. We'll talk about that in a minute. Now, I don't really like this approach. And the reason for that is, well, there are a few actually. First of all, I haven't personally found a single case where I would want my flow to continue the same way, regardless of whether there was an error or not. Usually, in most cases, I would want to either terminate right away or take different actions depending on the error. I wouldn't want it to continue the same way. And in this particular case, even though I did build the demo, I don't really need that, email that says, I failed to get the recommendations. It's useless for me anyway. It's just, I did it for the purpose of the demo. I couldn't come up with a reason for actually having a valid action in here otherwise. It's also quite tricky to continue in most cases because, especially if the actions and finally actually depend on the dynamic content of the actions in try, which means that, in this case, because it actually needs to send me an email with the contents of the select, I actually need to build in a relatively complex expression in here that actually checks whether or not there was an error. And then, pushes an appropriate body into the email to me so that I can handle the possibility of this failing and not returning any dynamic content without making this action fail. It adds extra complexity where it's really not necessary. Also, this action could still potentially fail even with that in mind. There could be some issues with the Office 365 services or whatever we put into finally. There could potentially be exceptions available for those actions as well. And we kind of usually wouldn't need to build in extra exception handling in here to handle that possibility as well, which kind of defeats the purpose of having it here. I would just still move it to try. And finally, I would normally want my flow to actually terminate as failed when it fails. I want to see in the logs, in the flow runs, that a certain flow has actually failed. But I can't do that in catch over here because if I put a terminate action over here, then finally will not run. And then it is useless, essentially. It's no longer relevant anyway. If I want to put it into finally here, I then again need to add extra logic to check whether or not catch actually ran, or whether or not there was an exception in try to determine on whether I need to terminate as failed or not. And that's, again, adding extra logic where it's not really necessary. And as you can see, my previous test, which actually failed, it still is flagged as succeeded, which is something I personally don't like that. But there are a couple of things that I want to share with you in this approach that are actually generic and will be the same in further approaches as well. So I'll just explain it in here. So the first thing is getting the actual error message. So as mentioned, this is the coalesce expression. Where, as previously described, I use the result on try. I sort it, get the first item, and parse it. And that's how I set it to a variable. I could just potentially push it directly into whatever I want. I then send myself an email. You could do whatever you want with it. You could, log it somewhere, push it to a SharePoint item, update a queue item, push it to a Dataverse table or a SQL database, or send it via Teams or whatever. I just did it via email because I like to be notified via email. It's just a personal preference, really not a recommendation. But the important part is getting it into a string and then doing whatever you want to do with it. And then the next thing is when I send myself an actual email, I'll send the message in there in the body, and I will also send a URL to the flow run. This is also a very important point because this URL is great. It will take me directly to the flow run. I can actually show you that via this error message over here. So if I copy this link and open it over here, this will take me to this failed run, which is still flagged as successful, actually. And there are a few great things about this URL. First of all, it has a longer retention span than a normal flow run history. It at least lasts longer than the last 100 runs, so that's great. You can access it after that happens. So especially important on flows that run very frequently. And it's also accessible to environment admins without actually needing to share the flow with them. So that's a great way to actually send, relevant people a notification about a failure. So they could see this and potentially debug it or do whatever they want with it without even needing to actually share the flow with them. Right, and the way to actually get it is just another expression, quite useful. It's just a simple concat expression that uses the generic URL for Power Automate with some workflow reference expressions as well. So that's quite simple and straightforward. So I get that in the very beginning all the time, and then I use it in the error message. Right. So that's that for this approach. The one that I would prefer and I like is a simplified version of that. You could call this a try catch without continue. It essentially is the same thing, but I named the scopes differently. I prefer to call them main and exception, but you could also call them try and catch. And the idea here is that I only have the two of them, and I've moved the last action from finally into main because really I don't need that email as mentioned if any of these actions fail. So, and then I've got the exception scope that still runs when something in main doesn't work. Right, so a few differences here. This makes it easier for me to set this action up. Again, I wanted a pretty email body with some formatting, so I still kind of did, and I wanted to handle the possibility of the select not returning anything. So I still built in an expression in there, relatively complex, but significantly simpler than the one I needed in finally, because I no longer need to handle the possibility of select having failed or being skipped. Because if any of these actions will fail, the send an email action will not even run. And the more important thing, and the thing I like about it, is the fact that I can actually now have a terminate action in here, which will fail with an error. I also push the actual error message in here, and I no longer need to build in logic around it to actually check whether I need to run it or not. If it is inside this scope, meaning it will only run if there is an exception, I actually definitely need to terminate. So, and since this actually generates the same kind of an output, I won't really show you a success scenario, but again, if I force this to fail, what will happen is that, and as you can see, the previous flow runs actually show up as failed properly because of the fact that I used the terminate. Right, so it does Run. Yeah, it should complete. Yeah, and it says it's failed for a change. That's a good thing. That's what I wanted. And I get this the same error message with the flow run URL as well. And I no longer get the recommendations that are not really recommending anything. So that's something I prefer. And it's also much, slightly cleaner and easier to read and basically easier to build. That's a simplified version that works very well for simple flows. Now, in some cases, you might want to have a slightly more complex scenario where you might want to have some different handling for, for different steps within the flow. Right. So in those cases, you might want to use the parallel branching approach. Now, this flow in here would just get me some recipes, and it will filter out those that I haven't tried yet. And then it would get a random one, get the ingredients, check whether or not I have everything I need, and then send me an email telling me that whether or not I can actually make that random cocktail that I haven't tried yet. So in this particular case, I don't really need this logic, but because the actual exceptions are exactly the same in my case. But this kind of an approach would make a lot more sense in cases where you're processing items, for example. So I'm not really writing back to SharePoint. I'm just reading from it. So I don't really, need different exception handling. But for example, if you were picking up items, whether from a queue or from a list or whatever, and the action of picking them up fails, meaning that you don't really get an ID of the item that you want to process, you would throw a generic exception, like what I'm doing here. You would get the message, you would maybe send yourself an email or a Teams notification or whatever, and you'd terminate without really processing any items. But then if you were actually processing items, and if you moved on to further steps and you'd process an item and the actual act of processing it failed, then you could potentially want to maybe do a different kind of exception handling, because you have already retrieved the item, you have its ID, so maybe you want to, update it as failed or whatever. So you would have different type of exception handling over here. But in my particular case, these are actually exactly the same, because I don't really need that. But depending on where my error occurs, this would make the different exception scopes kick in. So if it fails there, this scope kicks in. It's configured to only run when that one fails or times out. But if it succeeds, this one actually runs. And then if it fails, then this exception handling kicks in. These two are actually exactly the same. An important thing to note over here is that when we use this approach and when we try to get the error message, we need to modify our result expression slightly, because the result expression targets a specific container by using the name. So we need to modify that in every result expression that we use for all of the 4 schemas, or more if we find any more. So this one targets the get cocktails scope, whereas this one actually targets process cocktail, the next one. And that's what it is. So if I ran this in a successful scenario, what this will do, right? I've got an email. Yeah, it says I need to get to a grocery store because I'm missing a couple of ingredients to make a certain cocktail. And these are actually quite hard to get. That's why I don't have them. Right. And that's that for this one. And then there's another scenario where you might actually want to have an actual loop inside your flow to process several items. That's quite a frequent scenario, obviously, but there are a couple of ways in which you could go about it. So if for whatever reason you wanted to terminate the entire flow when a single item fails, which I don't really know why you would ever do that. That doesn't really make sense, but maybe I'm just not aware of a use case. Maybe there are cases when you want all of the other items to be skipped when a single one of them fails. Might be the case. But when you want to do that, you can't really use the same exception approach if the loop is within a scope. Because as mentioned, it's also a container and it also has a different schema. So what we would do in that case, we would put in another scope over here for the exception. And then we would handle the loop only. We would add it in there as, so that it only runs when the loop fails. Then we would need to modify the further action to also run if the exception scopes gets skipped. And then we would just do whatever we want to do there. We would add the, get the error message, add a terminate action or something. But didn't really feel like I need to build that sort of a thing into my demo because honestly, I don't really know of a scenario where I would want my flow to stop when a single item in the loop fails. The more reasonable and the more frequent approach is when we want a single item to be skipped and then further items to still get processed. And when that's the case, we need to build then the actual exception handling into the loop itself. So again, there could be two approaches in there. We could either move all of the actions that should be inside the loop to a separate child flow. And then when that happens, we would just, kind of do all of the handling in there inside the child flow and just return the outputs afterwards. That's perfectly valid. That's just a matter of preference. I just didn't really want to do that because then I would be switching between a couple of different flows during the demo. So I just did the other approach, which means that I just do another scope in here for the actual processing of the item. And then I have an exception handling over here. Now, when this happens, the exception part, again, can be whatever you want. It could just update an item with a failed status or something. I'm just sending myself an email. The important thing is that we don't actually terminate here. We couldn't even if we wanted because we can't really add and terminate action inside the loop. So we can't really do that, but we don't really want to do it anyway. So that's the difference with this scope. And then when it actually handles the exception, the loop itself is considered to have succeeded. And as such, this scope doesn't fail. If it does, it only fails if one of the other actions actually fails, and then this exception catches those. It doesn't touch the loop. And that's basically it. So if I run this one, right? This one will actually come back with a filtered list of my favorites that only include those where I have all of the ingredients that I have. So it's a bit shorter than the first one. Wait, where was that? What, this one? Because I don't have some of the ingredients. But if I were to make an item fail in there, right? So for example, I'll force this to fail. Again, it will fail because tried is a column in the ingredients, in the recipe list, whereas I'm just using it on the ingredients list, so it doesn't exist there. And so every single item failed. Obviously, that's not really the normal case. In most cases, we would actually expect one or two items within an array to fail, whereas others are actually, succeed. That's why we would just want to skip the failed items. Just, for the purpose of the demo, I was, when I'm forcing an error, that's quite hard to make. So what I get spammed with emails where it's, each of them says that, a single item failed. And then eventually I get an email with cocktail recommendation that says, it recommends me going to the grocery store because it thinks I have no ingredients for any of the recipes that I wanted to make. Right. And that is pretty much all there is to the demo. I'll switch back to the slides and have a few key takeaways to cover before we wrap up. So the best way to handle errors in Power Automate is, in my opinion at least, is more or less following the following guidelines, right? So we handle the containers by using the result expression instead of individual actions. Then we wrap the entire flow into a scope, for instance, main or try or whatever, and try to have minimum nesting, try to avoid having loops and conditions inside the scope. But if we absolutely need to have other containers like loops and conditions, then we handle them individually and separately from the rest of the actions within the same scope. And then, if you want, do whatever kind of reporting you want. Sending an email is my preferred option, but also remember to include the error details. And also, if you're actually sending it and not just logging it in a database or something, then the flow run URL as well. And if your flow actually fails, and it's not just a single item failing, make sure that you terminate the flow after handling, so it's not actually flagged as succeeded, even though it actually failed. Right. And these are the expressions I used, the coalesce expression, as mentioned, with all of the 4 different schemas. If you were to use this in your flows, remember to change the name of the scope that you're targeting with whatever name you actually use. That's the one thing you need to modify here. And if you ever find any further schemas that actually apply, then you just kind of, can add an extra line in here separated by a comma. If you do, drop me a message on LinkedIn. I would be interested in actually staying up to date on this. And then here is the one to get the flow run URL. This one doesn't need any modifications. It works perfectly fine on any environment and tenant you may have. Right, and then one more thing. I'm not sure if I have the time, but if you don't mind, there's one more thing that I really want to share. There's an alternative way to handling this. I recently came across an article by Peter Veenstra, who blogs on sharepains.com. He wrote about an upcoming feature called the flow run table in Dataverse. And this table actually includes all of the rows, all of the runs of your flows with their status and the error message if there is an error and so on. That's a great way to actually get the details of a flow, when it failed. However, I don't, it's a preview feature apparently. I have the tables, but I don't have a tenant where it's actually being populated at the moment. So I couldn't really show it to you during the demo, even though I really wanted to. So this screenshot is just from his article actually. But what this actually means is that if we use this table, we could in fact basically ignore everything I just said about error handling, because we wouldn't really need to use those scopes, at least for simple flows, because we could just have a single flow on our environment that is triggered by a new entry in this table where the status is failed. And when that happens, we just do whatever handling we want. We could resubmit the flow, we could send the message itself to a recipient or whatever we want. That's, that could make it easier, because then we wouldn't need to build in exception handling in each of our flows. Of course, that doesn't cover the, more advanced cases when we might want different handling for different actions within the flow, or maybe, when we want to have items skipped in a loop, but other items being processed, those would still need to have proper exception handling. But this could work for simple flows with just, a main and an exception scope. It also could work for, flows built by citizen developers who don't really follow the best practices, but then you could have environment admins being notified about it. It could just serve as a way to get statistics on flow runs and do some reporting or whatever. So plenty of applications, a great resource to follow when it actually becomes generally available. Right. And that's that. This is the time to cover questions if we have any, and if we have the time. And this is a QR code to my LinkedIn profile. If you want to connect, you can scan this and feel free to drop me a connection request.